Welcome to the Nemeth Report podcast. I'm Dr. Tammy Nemeth, energy historian, analyst, consultant, and I'll be your host. Today, I'm absolutely thrilled to be joined by Sarah Montalbano, Energy Policy Fellow at the American Air Experiment and a Senior Fellow of Energy and Conservation at the Independent Women's Forum. We're going to be talking about a lot of things, some of the key issues in American energy policy that are actually of concern in all Western countries these days, the real impacts of wind and solar, EV mandates, land use changes, and critical minerals. Hi, Sarah. Welcome to the program.
Hey, Tammy. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, before we start, I'm wondering if you can just take a moment to introduce yourself to our audience. What's your background? How did you come to write on these issues?
Yeah, I think it's a fascinating story. Honestly, I was born and raised in Wasilla, Alaska, and that might be familiar to your viewers as the place where Sarah Palin was mayor before she became governor. So I am from that place, and I became interested in natural resource issues because they're so important to Alaska. Oil and gas, timber, fisheries, even all of those aspects are really interesting to me. I worked for an Alaska think tank for several years. And then I came to Center of the American Experiment based in Minnesota about a year and a half ago. And we've been focused a lot on mining and minerals, less so on oil and gas because Minnesota doesn't really have oil and gas as a state. So it's been really interesting to get to work in this space. I think we're going to talk about my most recent research report, as well as some of the work I'm doing for the Independent Women's Forum. So I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Awesome. Well, I'm going to put it up on the screen here. It's the Shattered Green Dreams. And this is an amazing report. I really recommend people take a look at it. I'll have a link in the description. But what Sarah did a really amazing job here is where she talked about how wind and solar are often framed as free energy from sun and wind, but their life cycle from mining to waste, it's usually just kind of put in a footnote and not really discussed. And so, you argue in the very beginning, and this is a mantra that I have all the time, that every energy source has trade-offs. But these environmental downsides don't seem to be part of the equation. They're often downplayed. So what surprised you the most when you were quantifying this, when you were researching it, and how might acknowledging these trade-offs might inform the public conversation?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question to ask, first of all, because I think I had an understanding of the land use requirements of wind and solar, but I didn't really understand just how much land that could be. And when we talk about it, wind and solar are obviously intermittent. They're weather-dependent sources of energy. You have a lot of mining of materials to create them. You have the attendant impacts of manufacturing and construction. The landscape footprints, like I just mentioned, there are some ecological impacts. And the fact is that they last, only 20 or 25 years. Which means that you have repowering and recycling costs as well, because you need to keep manufacturing these things over and over again. So the landscape footprint, I think, is really the scary part to me, and that's because they're so intermittent and diffuse sources of energy. You have to have more land use in order to manufacture a equivalent amount of energy. So that was astounding to me.
I'm going to see if I can get to the right.
Oh, I love it. You've got the paper up. That's brilliant.
Yeah. So this slide is the required scale up materials demand, and this is a fascinating chart because it shows all of these different elements that are required in clean energy technologies: lithium, nickel, graphite, neodymium, copper, cobalt, steel, silicon, silver, aluminum. All of them, like, they're on this hockey stick. If you think about it, it's a hockey stick going up, because if you have all these different countries implementing the same policies, requiring all of these materials, that's going to increase the competition for them. So it's like the demand is up there, which then increases the price because there isn't necessarily enough of them to do what all the different countries want them to do.
Yeah.
Um, so if we can't recycle our way fast enough, I know what the European Union is talking about, they're going to have a circular economy. And so all these materials will just be kind of recycled and stuff like that as they wear out and they have to build again. Um, is that a realistic path forward? What's how can countries deal with this potential spike in demand and costs?
Yeah, I appreciate that setup, Tammy. The interesting part about that graph is that it's from a very pro net zero source. It's the Energy Transitions Commission.
Right.
So I think they are probably understating the demand for minerals we're going to have. They incorporated some recycling assumptions and assumptions about material demand going into the future with technology improvements and stuff. And I'm always skeptical that these things will work out the way we predict. And recycling is an interesting one because there is certainly the technical ability to recycle a lot of these things. You know, solar panels are 80, 85, 90% glass.
Yeah.
We know how to recycle glass, but the commercial pathways simply aren't there. And that's a huge problem. I think, only 10 or 15% of solar panels in the US are currently recycled because it is so much more expensive to do that than to simply dispose of them in a hazardous waste landfill or a regular landfill if you're not doing things properly. The costs don't work out for most situations. The other problem is with wind turbines. The blades on wind turbines are usually made of carbon fiber or fiberglass.
Yeah.
Um, and those are not really recyclable, at least in the sense that we know it. It's difficult to do. They're enormous pieces of technology. So what's happened, at least here in the U.S., and I'm sure it's true elsewhere, they just get cut up and put into landfills. And all of these materials aren't going to be recycled in a circular economy of any sense. So I think there's a lot of promise for minerals like copper. We're already
Yeah.
doing a lot of copper recycling. Maybe that's something that could bear out, but the rest of the minerals, other materials, I'm skeptical.
Yeah, I'm wondering how you recycle the lithium and various other things. I
Hmm.
know that they're
Well, I
having
mean,
difficulty.
yeah, and one of the things in my research that I think I note in this paper is that, we are recycling a bunch of consumer electronic lithium batteries, but a lot of manufacturers don't actually have the ability to recycle the bigger EV batteries or battery
Yeah.
storage technology. They don't have actual capacity to do the big ones. So even those pathways where we think we have things figured out, there's still some concerns about doing that commercially.
Yeah, for sure. I was watching a program where there was a recycling center for the EV batteries, and the amount of energy required to recycle them and the costs and so on. The only way they could make it happen is with significant subsidies. There just wasn't
Mhm.
the value for money, I guess, of that investment. So
Agreed.
I appreciate that.
Mhm.
Um, and with respect to the land use, I think that is fast. You had mentioned that, and I don't have a good graphic of it, but it's like wind and solar require at least 10 times more land per unit of power than hydrocarbons or nuclear. And so, if you have to distribute it so far across just to try and generate the same capacity, even if it's not necessarily being generating enough that people need, um, that's a real issue because you start to have competition with wildlife and the environment. So, I'm
Mhm.
wondering if you can tell us a little bit about what you found of the real environmental impacts on the siting of wind and solar.
Yeah, yeah, I'd be happy to. The land use is I think one of the most important things because wind and solar are so intermittent and diffuse, right? And so it's at least 10 times as much land as a coal or natural gas plant. When you talk about nuclear, it's actually even more stark, frankly. So at 1 gigawatt nameplate capacity nuclear plant only needs 1.3 square miles of land area, and I'm using miles because I'm an American. Um, but comparably, to generate the same amount of power as a 1 gigawatt nuclear plant, a solar would need 45 to 75 square miles. And wind turbines are even worse. They would need 260 to 3,360 square miles. So
Yeah.
that latter figure is about the size of, two of our little estates, Delaware and I want to say Rhode Island put together, and just to match 1 gigawatt plant. And I'm glad you tabbed to this because this really puts it in perspective here. To power the U.S. entirely on wind, it would take this land area of two Californias, and that's a 2010 estimate before electricity demand was rising due to AI and all those things. And then when we talk about global net zero, there's actually some peer-reviewed research out there that has modeled the potential land use of 10 different global net zero scenarios. And one of the ones that relies heavily on wind and solar, as well as electrification of transportation, thinking of EVs and things like that, would require about 900 million hectares. In the US is only about 940 million hectares. So, we're talking about global net zero taking up the land area of the United States just for electricity production. And, that's astounding to me. That is not a trade off we can reasonably make with agriculture, with all of the other myriad uses of land that we want to have across the world. And I particularly think this wouldn't make sense for a lot of European countries. You certainly don't have the land that we would in order to make this work. So that's my feeling on land use. Is this would really be a trade-off, sacrificing a lot of other worthwhile uses.
Yeah, and I know that wind, the effects on wildlife are absolutely catastrophic with wind turbines. But what bothers me, I think, the most about solar is there's this real push that solar can be installed quickly, and it's really great. And I'm thinking, okay, if it's roofs on commercial buildings, or if you and your as a homeowner wish to have that to back up your energy because the grid has become so unstable or something, yeah, great. That's fantastic. There shouldn't be subsidy for that. But it's when they take up farmland. So when like here in the UK, there isn't a lot of land to begin with, and they're actually paying farmers to take land out of production to turn it to plant trees or to put wildflowers or hedgerows and stuff like that. Um, but then they're buying up that land that used to be used for food and putting these massive solar arrays across the land, put big fences around it, and there was one of the renewable organizations were talking about the best places and worst places to locate solar. The UK was the second worst place. Number one was Ireland, and the UK's number two. And it makes no sense to number one is taking agricultural land out of production. Number two, putting it in places where it's the worst, second worst in the world. And number three, it's so diffuse, and with all of these different things, chemicals leaching into the land, land impaction, and so on. There's a lot of problems with this large rollout that's desired for net zero to put solar and wind everywhere.
Yeah, I can only imagine, because even here in the United States, our utility scale solar, I have no problem for residential applications, off-grid preppers, anyone who wants this should be able to procure it. I just don't think this should be subsidized. And what you find is that these solar companies, and even to some extent wind, they can really pay farmers a premium to take
Yeah.
this land. And I have no I have so much sympathy for farmers who are struggling to actually produce crops and sell them at a competitive price, who look at this and say, well, wind and solar are going to be the answer because they will give me a steady lease payment that's going to
Yeah.
be far more than actually working this land. I have no understanding of what that decision must be like. And
Yeah.
so I don't see the individual actors as the problem here. I see the system that we've got that is encouraging this. And what that has caused is in, the United States, I believe it's about 53% of our prime farmland or of new solar projects are located on prime farmland. And
Yeah.
then 83% or so is actually just on any agricultural lands. So the utility scale here is really the problem. And that does have attendant impacts on ecology and wildlife that I try to detail in my paper with the peer-reviewed research. And there's a lot of concerns, I think, about whales and offshore wind. I think those are well founded and they deserve
Yeah.
further scrutiny, frankly, because it's rather alarming what we've seen just anecdotally, especially in populations where one individual can make all the difference. The North Atlantic right whale, there's only 360 or so individuals left in the world. If we lose one, that really could mean the full outcome of the species. And wind turbines are demonstrated to at least have some evidence of risk of direct collisions with the infrastructure, changes to their habitat, their feeding and migration patterns, all of those things. And onshore turbines have some of the same issues with birds and bat mortality. Typically, birds are not. It's not the quantity that so much is concerning, but the kind of birds
Yes.
that you see.
Yeah.
A lot of eagles, a lot of shorebirds, and birds that tend to reproduce more slowly. And even solar panels aren't immune to this kind of environmental effect, other than the habitat fragmentation and fencing off wide areas of land. They can also, at the utility scale, cause a lake effect that has
Yeah.
been hypothesized. And you see birds swoop down towards it because they think it's a lake, it's reflective. And so there are collisions even with solar. So I care about the wildlife. I think there's a lot of good reasons for us to step back a little bit and examine this research more fully.
Yeah, I had done a research assessment back in March where I looked at a lot of the different academic literature out there about the environmental impacts of wind and solar.
Mhm,
And I was actually shocked at what I found with respect to what it does to the land.
mhm,
China seems to be the one country that is monitoring the impacts of all of these huge wind installations they've rolled out over the past 5 or 10 years, and they've been monitoring what's happened to the soil. They had good baseline data of what the moisture content was like in certain sort of semi-arid areas and whatnot. And what they found is that in all of the regions where they had put these wind turbines, it was drying out, I would say, down to about an inch, inch and a half of the soil. And it was also increasing the nighttime temperatures.
mhm,
So it was like and this had knock-on effects to the regional climate, which would then have a effect on the larger country nation of China itself. And so they were actually warning that maybe we have to reconsider where we're siting these, what it's doing, because it's actually changing the type of vegetation that grows in these semi-arid areas, and was actually diminishing biodiversity, which I
mhm,
really, that's very fascinating. And so I think with that, there's there needs to be maybe a rethink and more in-depth research of what these impacts are, so there can be an open conversation like you discuss, um, of really talking about these trade-offs. Are we
mhm,
willing to have the soil dry out and lose biodiversity over a vast area? It's not like it's 20 acres or something. It's like vast areas, um, and what are the long-term impacts of that? So, I
Mhm.
thought I would just share that with you because it really
Yeah.
resonated with me when I read your work. It's like, wow, yeah, there's a lot of research coming out now that maybe ought to be considered.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I hadn't seen that. There was a 2018 Harvard study that I reference in the paper that essentially notices that about local surface temperatures too. That the actual, and I don't have the numbers in front of me, so forgive me here, but the increase in the daily surface temperatures with a solar installation or wind installation would actually be outpacing the anticipated climate impact of
Yeah.
the warming. And so it's like,
Yeah.
why would we do
Why
that if right. I think it's pretty obvious in a lot of cases that the construction process is going to be taking away a ton of topsoil, a lot of the fertile agricultural soil that you would need to even think about rehabilitating this. So it's good to see some research out. It's a little astounding to me that China is taking more notice of their environment than the United States is. Uh,
I know, I know, I
but
know. Like reducing soil moisture by up to 4.5%. I mean, that's insane.
yeah.
And I think I just pulled up the David Keith study that you're talking about, which is the one from
Thank
Harvard
you.
in 2018 in his group, and it was showing near surface temperature increases up to almost a degree Celsius.
Mm,
And in Texas, the large wind projects raised the local temperatures by 0.72 degrees Celsius.
wow.
So, global mitigation estimates are supposed to be between zero point 0.1 and 0.12 degrees Celsius. And
Mm.
here it's like 0.72. So, yeah, it's
Yeah,
actually making the problem worse. So, yeah. Um,
exactly.
so last bit on this paper. On electricity prices, if we roll out all of this wind and solar and it's diffuse, which means you have to have a lot of interconnections and buildup of the wiring and the transmission cables and substations and all of these things, um, the data seems to show that without subsidies, wind and solar increase the price to consumers. So, from your perspective, is the cheap renewables narrative holding up?
I would not say so, and, I think the US is a pretty clear, example of that right now. Our latest reconciliation bill actually, repealed a lot of the subsidies for wind and solar, the Inflation Reduction Act's tax credits, for them. So they can only get, the tax credits if they are, um, uh, started construction under some definition by July of next year, or is entering full service by the end of next year. And what we're seeing is that a lot of these companies and a lot of these projects are saying, "Wow, we are no longer profitable. We are no longer economically able to do this," and they are pulling out entirely, which I think is just a case in point here. And also. The price problem with renewables is a lot about the fact that not only do you have to build the transmission, the substations to bring all of this electricity from these, more rural areas where the wind is and the sun is, but you also have to have to maintain a basically second electric grid because you need to you need to be able to ensure that you are able to meet peak demand. So that means that you will still need natural gas peaking capacity. You might even consider keeping your coal plants able to be ramped up at a moment's notice. You might consider having more nuclear plants because those can provide a steady baseload resource for you. So you have most of the same costs of running a a grid powered on natural gas and coal and oil peaking power. But you also have to build a massive amount of wind and solar. So, my organization, Center of the American Experiment, has historically done some modeling on the state effects of, mandates for 100% clean electricity by 2040. And in Minnesota, that's going to cost hundreds of billions of dollars to do that. And frankly, it's only become more expensive now that we've shown that without federal government subsidies, many of these projects are no longer economical.
Yeah, and I mean, Minnesota is kind of like the absurdity of Canada, where it's a cold climate, and how you're going to keep warm with a heat exchanger, and in the wintertime, if it's unreliable. I mean, I just think of what the damage that will do to people's lives. I mean, it's
Mhm.
just crazy.
Yeah, I mean, it's particularly absurd when we look at, the damage done in 2021 with Winter Storm Uri in Texas, of all places. Hundreds of people died. And the thinking there is just, well, if we have a blackout like this in MISO, where Minnesota is a part of that regional grid, that is going to really affect people. And it's not just
Yeah.
going to be lost lives, it's going to be economic growth, it's going to be, damage to homes, property damage if when the pipes freeze, repairs. All of that
Yeah.
is really something we need to be thinking about because the value of reliability has been so understated up until the past 6 months when we've had an administration that cares about that. Reliability and affordability need to be the name of the game.
Yeah, and it's really fascinating now with the AI and data centers suddenly becoming a priority. And now the conversation is, oh well, we need reliable energy for the data centers and for the AI that's going to manage everything that we do. But you, citizen, you're just going to have to suck it up with the unreliable energy.
Yeah, and I've been enjoying watching this data centers debate take shape because I think there's a lot of ways in which utilities are using them as a scapegoat for saying, "Oh, we just can't provide all of this electricity. We have to turn down this data center." And it's like, well, you were very close to rolling blackouts before when it was just the residential and the regular industrial customers. And I also think it's a convenient villain to say, oh, look at these big tech companies coming in with our data centers. The truth is that a lot of these things would be economically great for the places where they want to site, but particularly in Minnesota passed a really they call it first in the nation. I also hope it's last in the nation, right? Because it's putting a series of new taxes on them. It's putting a bunch of environmental regulations about their water consumption and
Yeah.
all of these really restrictive ways. And then what do you imagine happens here? Amazon decided to pull out of a plant that they were planning in Minnesota. They had a data center, set up. They bought the land. They were ready to go, and then they got this unfavorable regulatory environment and pulled out. So I think it's a very clear sign that data centers are coming whether we like it or not, and our monopoly utility grids need to be able to provide for it, or they will just go elsewhere.
You make a really great point about the regulatory environment, and if there's too many obstacles put up, then what company's going to participate in that jurisdiction? And I'm sure we're going to talk about that more when it comes to the critical minerals, because one of the things that's been holding back North America, and other Western countries, particularly in Europe, is the whole regulatory structure that basically makes it impossible to mine anything, to have any kind of really intensive um, resource extraction happening. And there's all
Mhm.
these roadblocks that get put up, these regulatory processes, and so on. But that kind of is an interesting segue into Norway's
Mhm.
transition to electric vehicles. You had this great piece on independent women
Mhm.
where and it's titled Norway's EV transition is funded by oil and gas royalties, and I'll put a link to that in the description as well. Now, one of the things that Norway did, which is so fascinating, is that it used all of these sticks against conventional vehicles. They increased the tax exponentially. They made it really, really expensive for people to actually own a vehicle with an internal combustion engine. And then
Mhm.
they put all of these different incentives and so on, for electric vehicles. So can you, um, can you provide some key lessons that maybe US policymakers can take from this? Is it possible in the United States? Why not? Why isn't it possible? And one of the interesting things is that you describe it as manufacturing demand.
Mhm.
I wonder if you could just speak to that.
Yeah, thank you. This is a piece that I'm really glad that I did in hindsight, but it was something I didn't know a lot about, because I saw all of these headlines. There were just, a month or 2 ago, Norway is all in on electric cars.
Yeah.
They're bragging about this, and, I looked deeper into it, and, they are, um, planning to, get rid of, well, to have all new passenger cars and light vans in this year, 2025, be zero emissions, and they've done it with the sticks. They have, even, on their own websites, they have, quote, a combination of taxation rules and incentives. For the high adoption of EVs. EVs are exempt from a lot of other things too, like road usage taxes. They're only charged 70% of toll road rates. So there's a lot of carrots on one side, sticks on the oil, the gas side of the equation. Um, and I think that is really amazing because they acknowledge that this is incredibly costly, to the nation. And then I thought, well, how are they able to fund their government? And then you look into it, and the oil and gas sector in Norway is the largest, in
Yeah.
terms of its value added, government revenues, investments, export value, all of those. It was 21% of their GDP, 32% of their revenues, and 48% of their total exports. So they have a really heavily oil and gas, based economy, and they're using it to force their population into the EV system, by just making it incredibly costly. And I think that not only is that hypocritical, first of all, but they ought to be considering the costs of the lithium and the cobalt and the nickel, all of that involved in the manufacturing of EV batteries, which I talk about in my Shattered Green Dreams paper. Is that these things have environmental impacts too, especially
Yeah.
if you are sourcing them from not responsible allies, and who are damaging their own environment, or having a child labor sometimes in these manufacturing processes. So, it's really Norway's situation has proved to me that you can twist the screws hard enough, to manufacture all of this demand so that 90% of your new car sales are EVs. But it simply wouldn't work here in the United States. I think there's a clear, bias for, cars that can go longer range, frankly, than a lot of EVs. And you would really have to twist the screws a lot harder in order to make something like this happen in the United States.
Yeah, I we hear it a lot in Canada as well that, why don't we just follow Norway's example? Norway's amazing. They've done all this stuff. They can balance all these different things. And then when you get into the weeds of, okay, how are they able to do some of this stuff? They only have 5.5 million people. They have a significant urban density.
Mhm.
So a lot of people live in the cities. They have district heating in some places and so on.
Yes.
90% of their electricity is hydro. They export a lot of it. And they have this massive oil wealth and actually a very small geographic area. Then
Mhm.
you've got America, 330 million people with a vast geography, a diverse energy mix. In Canada, I think we have 40 million people, maybe it's more now, with second biggest country in the world, very cold,
Mhm.
and where there's lots of distances, population density is very small. So it's like there's sometimes it's not replicable. So
Yeah.
if you're in this small area, okay, maybe you can make it happen. But I do know, speaking to some people who live in Norway, everybody has a second car that has an internal combustion engine. So,
Precisely.
they might use the new EV to, putter around town and do
Ooh,
stuff like that, but if they're going out to their cabin or they're going hiking or something like that, chances are they're taking their reliable vehicle.
yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, your points, about the batteries and the supply chain, I think are really well taken because is Norway, did you find that
Mhm.
they're taking that sort of, that supply chain ethics into consideration, or do they just kinda not think about it?
I wasn't looking for it, but I didn't see it. It wasn't something that was, popping up proudly in this kind of research. So I'm sure there's some lip service paid to it, but at the end of the day, Norway can't really police all of the different sources that are going into all of the kinds the make and models of EVs that consumers might purchase, right? So it's a little bit of an impossible task, but we do know that these things have environmental impact and those ought to be considered. A 2024 Department of Labor report, I think, really hammers this home. They interviewed cobalt workers in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where we get, the bulk of our cobalt. And they found that 44% couldn't refuse to do hazardous work. 85% reported restrictions on their movement, and 52%, a majority of workers reported children working at their mine sites. It's especially true for artisanal mines that are, smaller and not associated with bigger companies. Those were 63% of artisanal mines had workers reporting that there were children at their mine sites. So this isn't a problem we don't know about. This isn't a problem that is just so underreported that we can't say that we didn't know. This is really appalling that we have public policies in all of these countries. Even until recently, the United States was trying to push new car sales to be almost fully EVs.
Yeah.
Very up until very recently. So we know about this, and we're choosing to do this, and we're choosing not to strengthen our domestic critical mineral supply chains too, which is obviously something of interest to Minnesota, given our our cobalt, nickel, copper deposits.
Right, okay, so
Mhm.
that's great that we can segue on to the next one, which is your piece on the 5 new minerals designated critical by the
Yeah.
US Interior Department. Now, um, already, I think cobalt is listed as a critical mineral, and there's I think the list was originally like 49, but now there's these new ones. It takes it up to 54 or something.
Mhm.
And the prioritization is for domestic production, and the European Union is trying to do something similar. Canada's trying to do so. I think it's like all the G7 and OECD countries and whatnot to try and have less vulnerable supply chains and be able to produce these minerals in a more ethical manner. Um, so
Yeah.
What what gaps in the US supply chains does this close, and how might this accelerate mining reforms? Because you just
Mhm.
described the roadblocks put up for data centers in Minnesota. What are the roadblocks going to be for increasing mining?
Tammy, goodness, it is a really, really hard process to open a new mine in the United States. There's a lot of states that have, more friendly, I think, permitting processes, but here the local governments have some say, state governments have some say. If you are crossing or at all impacting federal lands, then the federal government has to get involved in a permit. So that is a enormous number of permitting steps, and that is one of the reasons that American Experiment and I are very interested in the permitting reform efforts that are being done here in Congress to try to speed up that process to not take any shortcuts with the environmental safety and those steps, but to consolidate some of the paperwork, because they're going to half a dozen different agencies at any given time doing a lot of duplicative work. So first of all, that's, I think, important. The second part is this critical minerals list, because the The U.S. Geological Survey, as part of the Department of the Interior, collects a list of critical minerals. And, my feeling on it is that a critical mineral is whatever the market is demanding a lot of. But, there's some certain benefits to being on this list for domestic production, right? Because on the list, they have to, say that look, this mineral is essential to the economic security of the United States or the national security. They have supply chains that are vulnerable to disruption,
Yeah.
and are a vital component of some product that Americans would really miss, that would have significant consequences. So, being on this list means you have more direct investment opportunities with the U.S. For domestic projects, tax incentives, streamlined mining permits. So what the USGS has recommended for inclusion, and this is part of a public comment period right now, so this isn't totally final, but my guess is these will go through. We have new minerals for potash, silicon, copper, silver, rhenium, and lead. And so they also recommend removing arsenic and tellurium, which are kind of borderline decisions based on uh, uh, new domestic sources that have come online in the last couple of years. So,
Right.
this is a really important step, especially for copper being the electrification mineral, right? We are going to need tons of copper if we even want to think about net zero, but we're also going to need a lot of it for data centers and electric transmission and
Yeah.
all of this stuff that we find really important. And the Department of Energy has for a long time considered copper part of its list of critical materials. And there's a lot of
Hmm.
people saying, why do we have two separate lists? Why don't we just have one list, or make sure all that's on one list is on the other list? So that's a kind of, I think, unique part of U.S. bureaucracy here. But reconciling these lists, putting copper and silver on the critical minerals list will enable domestic copper projects to take advantage of some of this stuff that will help them come up and get streamlined permits and some direct investment if needed to get off the ground. So I think this is a positive step.
Yeah, and I think don't they also, I think at the end of your post there, you were talking that they're specifically soliciting comments on the inclusion of metallurgical coal and uranium
Mhm.
on the list as well. That
Yeah.
seems pretty significant too.
It does. It really does. And this is in part because of executive orders that direct the USGS to take a look at this. And uranium and metallurgical coal have not been on the critical minerals list because I believe it's a 2020 law, the Energy Act of some sort, actually specifies that they can't be non-fuel minerals, or that the critical minerals have to be non-fuel minerals, excuse me. So
Okay.
these are fuel minerals, and I'm very curious to see how they do this, and determine if they do actually put these on the list, or if legislative action would be needed to allow those things. But I think it's kind of indisputable that uranium is incredibly important. The United States doesn't have really any domestic uranium production for our nuclear power plants. I think we're importing 99.9% of our uranium, and that's a Energy Information Administration statistic. I'm not making that up.
Yeah.
And a lot of that has been from Russia, which has obviously tamped down in the light of geopolitical events here. So we could desperately use some more uranium and domestic production of uranium. But I'm very curious to see where the USGS takes this.
Yeah, I'd be so curious to see whether they reinstitute the stockpiling program that they used to have during the Cold War,
Yeah.
in order to be able to balance spikes in the market. Because I think of in
Mhm.
particular what happened with the cobalt mine, the first cobalt mine in America that was
Mhm.
on that border between Idaho and Colorado. I think it was
Yeah.
2023. They started operation, and within a couple of months, They were put out of business because China just watched, waited for them to make all that investment. Then they flooded the market to crash the price. So,
Yeah.
you know, when you have a potential hostile force or nation that seeks to manipulate the market in such a way, I mean, because they control that market, and
Mhm.
to just add more on in order to dilute the price. um, if America and the Western countries continue to have stockpiles, they would be able to sort of have a buffer or a response to that. But instead, this company went out of business. So
Mhm.
um, I think that's a good lesson. I think that's what they're trying to do with that new mine. I think that they were opening up with the joint project with the Defense Department or Department of War in
Yeah,
California.
that's right.
So yeah, so it's interesting that I'll be curious to see if they actually do another stockpile or something.
Yeah, yeah, I agree, and I think there's a lot of precedent for a critical minerals stockpile. I mean, we're already doing this with the Strategic Petroleum Reserve.
Yeah.
And the petroleum reserve was raided by the Biden administration simply to lower gas prices. And I think we need more safeguards on it than that. But I think a critical minerals stockpile could make a lot of sense. And it brings me around to another point with China's influence here, because this is clearly a national security issue. And not only those minerals that we're getting directly from China, that's a problem, but also China has extended its influence to a lot of other countries, and indirectly or directly control those supplies. So I think a key part of this needs to be kind of friend shoring with allies in Canada, Australia, Europe, wherever we need to get these minerals. We are constrained by our geology, right? We will not always
Yeah.
have geologically the minerals that we need, so we need to ensure that we can really do this safely and responsibly with countries that we know are doing it safely and responsibly too.
Right, like, it was
Mhm.
fascinating to see potash on that list because 90% of American potash is from Canada. Canada's the
Yeah.
largest potash producer. I'm actually from a region in Canada that
Wow.
has the massive, potash, deposits as well as uranium. So Saskatchewan, which is, uh, just north of North Dakota there,
Mhm.
massive amount of resources. America, when you cited the uranium,
Mhm.
most of the uranium is imported from Canada, Australia, Russia, Kazakhstan, and Uzbekistan.
Yep.
So again, Canada is an important partner there with the United States with potash, and which is essential for fertilizer,
Oh yeah.
um, and the uranium. So I hope that Canada and the United States can work out their trade differences in order to be Fortress North America.
Yeah, me too. Me too. Gosh, I mean, there's a point where you think, okay, this. It's reasonable enough to add potash to the list because maybe Canada will need a lot of this. We don't know. We can't forecast what Canada's demand is going to be for its own domestic sources. But in the same way, we have to be really, I think, strategic about how the United States brings its power and brings countries into its circle. Because even in the Congo, there are a lot of deals that these countries have made with China that they now say are, oh boy, these were not good deals for us. We would
Yeah.
love if the United States would help us get out of this. And that's an opportunity too. I think for us to really, really secure the supplies that we need. So,
Yeah, that's a great point. Okay. I know we have about 7 minutes left to get into these
mhm,
last two.
time
So,
flies.
time flies. You're one on the Interior Department. So the
Mhm.
title is the Interior Department to consider land use for energy projects on public lands. Can you just give us a brief summary of what Interior Secretary Doug Burgum is proposing?
Yeah, yeah. I think this is an interesting one because Burgum has signed a secretarial order, essentially asking agencies, well, Interior, to recognize the disproportionate land use requirements of wind and solar. And we've talked about that, so I'm not going to get into it. But, the order requires agencies to consider a calculation called capacity density, which is the quantity of electricity and energy project produces per acre of land it uses. And on that order, they have a table where they go through the calculations, and obviously advanced nuclear is the densest. You can get 33 megawatts per acre of land you use. Least dense sources are obviously offshore wind and solar and onshore wind. So, it's not a death sentence for wind and solar on public lands. It's really using the National Environmental Policy Act to say, okay, that, the Interior Department needs to consider this, all of these reasonable alternatives that have a higher density than the project that's being considered. But a lot is hinging on that reasonable definition. What is reasonable for the economics of the project, for the location of the land, things like that. And they have a lot of discretion to ask. So I think it's a positive step towards recognizing some of these environmental trade-offs, and asking agencies to really think about it when they're approving these projects.
So do you think that this will empower denser sources like nuclear, or is this just adding another layer of bureaucracy?
I think that's an interesting question. I think it's going to favor denser sources. I don't think it will be a complete block on wind and solar. I think there's a lot of concerns about that. And again, it really depends on the definition of reasonable. What's a reasonable
Right.
alternative depends on the land and the project. But I think we ought to be careful about using the NEPA that way, frankly, because NEPA has been a bureaucratic process. There are efforts being made to slim it down, but we want to be just careful that we're not adding an undue burden to the process here. So that's my feeling on it. It's a positive step, but we ought to be careful about implementation.
For sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
So how do you think this aligns with the broader goals of energy independence? Do you think that there could be unintended consequences of having this kind of everything must be this kind of energy density?
Yeah, I think that's probably not a serious concern here, and here's why. I think the idea that wind and solar support energy independence is kind of just a messaging play, right? Because these things are not all that independent when they have to be wired through miles and miles and miles of transmission lines to get to the nearest population. The other problem is that, as we just talked about, they're being mostly sourced from overseas, right? So that's not an energy independent move either. We ought to be very thoughtful about the kind of projects that make sense for a given parcel of land. I think there are many acres in the United States that could only be used for wind or solar if there was going to be energy production on those lands. But I think there's also a lot of trade-offs that make it a serious question of, well, if wind and solar are the only things that make sense here for a resource perspective, then are these worth the trade-off at all? Would we rather leave this open for a future, technology to understand a better use case for it? So, yeah, that's
Okay.
generally my feeling. Yeah.
That ties everything kind of together. So
Mhm.
thanks for sort of ending that way. But
Thank you.
as we wrap up, if listeners take one thing away from your work, what should it be?
Everything has trade-offs. Everything. And anyone who's telling you that there aren't trade-offs to these things is trying to sell you on something.
Okay, that's excellent. Well, thanks so much for your insights, Sarah. This has been a fantastic conversation. I will have links to Sarah's work in the description, so please check her out. Can people find you on X or LinkedIn, Substack?
Yeah. Yeah, I was gonna say I have a Substack called Montalbano Mondays. I would love if you all would go in and subscribe to hear from me once a week on Mondays. You can also find my work on AmericanExperiment.org. And if you like what you heard today, if you like the research I've been putting out, we would be so appreciative if you would donate to our project and to our cause. So those are my main sources. I also have an X account, I think, but I don't really post there. So yeah, thank you so
You're
much
not
for
even
having me.
you're
I'm
not
not
even
sure.
sure if you have
I
an
think I
X.
got it. Yeah, it's been a while. But Substack is my place. That is what I'm loving recently. So yeah,
Yeah,
find me
me
there.
too. Yeah. That's
Yeah,
so awesome. Okay, so people check out Sarah whenever you can. Drop by theamericanexperiment.org. Links will be in the description. And thanks so much, Sarah.
thank you, Tammy. I appreciate it. This was great.